Our guest for this series is Paul Kelly, who has been the Chief Executive of Fáilte Ireland, the National Tourism Development Authority, since 2017. Paul leads Fáilte Ireland as it helps the tourism industry, Ireland's largest provider of employment, to survive through and recover from the COVID-19 crisis. He has led Fáilte Ireland to be listed in the top 20 best large organisations to work in and the only public sector body to be on this list. In 2020, Paul was named as Ireland's most trusted leader by Great Places to Work. Prior to his appointment as CEO of Fáilte Ireland, Paul held several management and marketing leadership roles. Welcome to the Mindset Shift, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to you today.
Good afternoon, Tim, and thanks very much for having me on your interview.
So in the Mindset Shift, we want to find out about the person and obviously what drives the person in their career, but it's really about the person first that we're very keen to find out. So tell me a bit about Paul Kelly.
Wow, well, where do I start? Grew up in Wexford. I came from a retail background. My father had a small independent electrical retail shop on the main street in Wexford town, and I learned, the realities of business on the shop floor, wheeling and dealing, trying to sell televisions and stereo systems, etc., to the good people of Wexford. I went to St. Peter's College there in Wexford, and then went on to University College Dublin, where I studied commerce. Then went into a long and very enjoyable career in the private sector. I started out with Procter & Gamble in the UK, and I then went on from there to came back to live in Ireland after traveling around the world for a year, and then I worked for Diageo in Ireland for about 10 years. I worked in Aviva, the insurance group, for about 5 years, ending up in a European marketing director role there, and did consultancy then for a while before landing my current job, which is Chief Executive of Fáilte Ireland. So that's kind of a potted career history.
So let's go back to Wexford Town and your upbringing. Tell me about your family's structure. Were you the only child, or had you other siblings?
Yeah, I was the youngest of three. One older brother, older sister. We all kind of helped out in the family business, and obviously this was in the 1970s and early 80s. Tough times in terms of trying to run a business in Ireland, a family business, and I think in terms of it, and my father, by his own admission, was always a better salesman than he was a managing director or a finance director, which meant he far preferred to spend his time chatting to his customers than in terms of making sure that the finances were exactly the way they needed to be, and that probably led into difficulty as his business grew, and we did, in terms of went through a couple of very tough years with where difficulties with banks, difficulties with taxmen, difficulty was in insurance companies, etc., etc. And I suppose it's a time I particularly remember now as I deal with so many of the tourism industry and the hospitality industry and the difficulties they're having on COVID, that I have that very personal sense of how difficult that is for families in when their businesses in the kind of financial strain that businesses are under now. And in the case of the businesses now, it's through no fault in how the business was being run. But it is that, in terms of, I know what it's like to be a kid when, as I say, the guys with the brown suits come knocking on the doors, in terms of knocking on your family home door, not just your business door and stuff like that. So, so it's I suppose it's something that motivates me now to do everything I can to help all of those businesses, small and medium-sized businesses all around the country that are struggling to recover, to survive first and then recover from the pandemic. I suppose the other thing about my childhood that was probably pretty defining was, as your visitors can see, but they may not know, I have white hair, but I had white hair since the day I was born. I was born with two medical conditions. One was ocular albinism, it's called, which is basically pale skin, white hair, very short-sighted, and a flaw with my eyesight that can't be corrected with lenses or glasses or surgery. So so it just, I mean, that was something that I just had to still do, have to battle with, as it were. And but particularly, I mean, technology makes it much easier these days when you can just zoom out with your fingers and make the screen bigger and make the text bigger and get bigger screens and stuff. But trying to see chalk on a blackboard from school back in those days was always very difficult. And the other thing then, I was also born with a defective heart valve, which meant that I wasn't really, as a kid, I wasn't able to run, or wasn't able to engage in sports and stuff like that. That led to a massive heart attack when I was 14. When my way of dealing with that was to think that I'll overcome the pain in my chest by just getting fitter and trying to push myself as hard as I can to get fitter. Unfortunately, I pushed myself too hard one day in PE class and ended up with a massive heart attack, frightening my PE teacher no end, I'm sure. But luckily, he brought me around through pumping my chest, got me back again, thank God. And then went on and had an operation and got that fixed, etc. So, they were probably some of the the key defining things from my childhood.
I'm going to just tease that a bit further, Paul, if you don't mind, those two challenges you had, because if you think of Ireland in the 70s, 80s, particularly a county like Wexford, which is very sporting as a county in that sense. So you stand out for two reasons. First of all, you stand out because obviously you have pale skin, okay, and you have light hair. So you're standing out from the crowd visually in that sense. And then physically, you're standing out from the crowd because you can't run as fast or you can't run as far because you have obviously a defective heart valve issue. How did you cope with that? I mean, you're at a very vulnerable age of your life, from primary school to secondary school, and how did you cope with that?
Gosh, I don't know. I suppose it was just always the way it was, and in terms of and people knew they could tease me because of how I looked, and run away, and I wouldn't be able to run after them, kind of thing. And stupidly, I did try and run after them, kind of thing, which only of course encouraged them to do it more. Yeah, look, I mean, it was just always the way it was, and I suppose in those days, you kind of lived by the mantra of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, kind of thing. Which, of course, we know the names do hurt, but you just try and convince yourself they shouldn't, and you don't let them hurt. And I know that's easier said than done, for sure. But yeah, in terms of it was just the way it was. So you kind of got on with it and did the best. I remember in school we had to myself and my best pal, who I would have been lost without. He was in my primary school with me, came into my secondary school, and I used to sit beside him, and he would take down the stuff on the blackboard and I would copy it out of his copy. So he had me leaning over his copybook constantly, and because I needed to be really close to it, I was really leaning over it to see what he had written. And but we also we had to separate our desk from all of the other kids and move it up to be right in front of the teacher's desk, with a space behind our desk and the rest of the class desk, so that I could make out more of what was on the blackboard. And even then I couldn't make out all of it, but it helped me make out more of it. So yeah, so look, I mean, you just kind of coped as well as you could. I mean, one of the things interestingly was that I learned to listen better, and I learned to figure things out because I couldn't see the full equation on the blackboard. I could maybe see 3/4 of it, but is that a 5 or an 8? I'm not sure. Is that an X or a multiplication sign? I'm not sure. So you kind of, I learned to figure things out, and I learned to listen and plug that in, and right throughout my life, they've been skills that have really helped me, in terms of it. And I wouldn't have learned those skills had I not had the eyesight challenges I had.
It's interesting just listening to you reminiscing on it, Paul, because even the visualization for me of, you're close to the teacher now. There's a gap between the both of you, yourself and your best pal, and the rest of the class, and you have to lean over him. And all of this, while you're learning to become a teenager, while you're learning to become, part of second level school, and try and do the best you can in that context. But the listening is something that stands out for me, because many of us don't listen as well as we should. That's one of the traits we all could do all better on in that sense. But what is that I would say, when I hear somebody like you who's so successful in your career, for people who are in school today or who are in college today and who may not be doing as well because of whatever circumstances, the world doesn't end because of the challenge you're given. It's how you respond to the challenges. And what you did, in your words, you figured it out, how best you can respond to the challenges. And then you found that listening was giving you an advantage to deal with the disadvantages that you had been given by genetics and by natural birth. Is that a fair reflection?
I think it is, but it wasn't until many years later, when that I realized I kind of learned that skill. It was actually when I was, when I was working after 4 or 5 years in Procter and Gamble, that somebody pulled me aside and said, in those senior meetings, they said, one of the things you're really good at is in the broken play of meetings. When after the formal presentation, when the questions are going around the table, and there's things coming from left, right, and center, said, you're really good at coming back and saying, actually, no, that question you asked wasn't answered, but here's the answer to it. And understanding what question a senior person asked that wasn't actually answered the way they wanted it answered. And so I didn't realize until decades later that I'd actually learned that skill, and that was, to me, that was just trying to keep going. I wasn't conscious that I was listening any better than anybody else. I was just conscious that between the different senses and mechanisms that I had, I was doing my best to kind of figure it out, and then that skill kind of silently built, I think.
And tell me, how did you recover from the heart attack? 14 years of age is an exceptionally young age to get a heart attack. Created obviously because of the defect that you were born with, and then the fact that you were pushing yourself beyond what your heart was capable of dealing with in that sense. How did you deal with that, like in the immediate period, looking back at it now, and since then? Because that's obviously, to have a heart attack is a challenge in its own right. To have it at such a young age must be a very difficult challenge, and then to recover and deal with it.
Yeah, I suppose I didn't even, as these things happen, I didn't know I'd had a heart attack until I'd actually come through it and been brought back, kind of thing. And then I went into hospital. At the time, I had to wait about 2 months for the surgery. There was only one place in Ireland at the time that did heart surgery, and that was the cardiac theatre in the Mater Hospital. I was under a cardiologist in Vincent, so I had to wait for about 2 months in Vincent. I felt absolutely fine. To me, I was perfectly normal again. I was bored senseless, if you can imagine. 1980, what year was it? 1982, and no iPads, no PC games. The phone was the big black thing down in reception of the hospital that you stuck your finger in to dial home and put coins in. So the only TV was down in the day room, and it only had RTE1 and RTE2 on it, So, and I was in a ward full of middle-aged men. So the boredom was actually the big thing. I drove them nuts trying to play cards all the time. So, that was one memory of it, certainly, was counting the days to when I could have the operation. And I didn't have a date. It was just like, well, we're still waiting. And so look, I eventually had the operation. The operation went very well, and I was making a fine recovery. A couple of days after, about 4 or 5 days after the operation, I had my really bad moment. I woke up feeling queasy and a little bit lightheaded, and that deteriorated over the following kind of hour or so, where I began to feel very sick. and very lightheaded, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was going wrong. All my vital signs, my blood pressure, my temperature, everything was still my pulse, everything was still fine. But my body had been compensating for what was really going on. And what was really going on was I'd had a massive internal bleed into the stomach, which ended up with me vomiting blood all over the place. Not a pretty picture. And that was the moment when, you know, at that stage I couldn't hardly raise my head off the bed without feeling like I was going to faint. And I went into massive shock. That was the stage I was probably most scared, more so than the heart attack or the heart operation, because I was awake for all of it. It was terrifying. I was convinced I'm not going to make it. You know, the vision of pints of your own blood pouring all over you and all over the floor and all over the nurses and doctors and stuff. It was a horrendous vision. I went into shock at that time. My body was shaking violently, hopping off the bed. It took about 5 nurses, doctors, orderlies sitting on me and lying on me to get me still enough to get a needle into my arm to get some blood transfusion going. And they just couldn't, must have taken about 15-20 minutes to try and get me still enough to do that. But they eventually got it, and then started the recovery from that. But that was a horrendous few days, much worse than the heart operation. I couldn't eat or drink anything because of fear it was going to make the bleeding worse. I was allowed to suck 3 ice cubes a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner was an ice cube, and that was all I was allowed. And I have a rare blood type, and I remember the conversation between the heart surgeon and my parents the day before I went in for the operation, where the heart surgeon was reassuring my parents that, yeah, we now have enough of Paul's blood to operate. And at this stage, they'd done the operation. I'd had over 3 full blood transfusions. There was 28 bags of blood had gone into me, and they couldn't operate because they didn't have enough blood. So that was like, when are they going to run out? So they put a national call out. The Irish people answered as they do, and they got enough blood in, and there was enough of my blood type in it in terms of blood donations from the general public that they were then able to go in and operate and fix the bleeding stomach ulcer, and then after that it was plain sailing. About another 2 or 3 weeks in hospital and home to recuperate and recover. And after that, it was, you know, in terms of, I didn't know myself. I could now run the length of my back garden without having a chest pain anymore. I could now kind of play sports. Now I wasn't any good because I hadn't had 14 years of developing the skills, really, you know. But I could at least play, and I could at least run now without chest pain and stuff like that. So and that was like a whole new lease of life then for me.
I'm fascinated about the return home, because you made a point earlier that your dad was a salesman and not necessarily a good businessman, and the challenges that posed. So he obviously sold a lot of product, but then, you know, not being able to run the business as we would see it in today's world, Paul, from a business point of view, presented huge challenges. And also the economy was different at that point in time. How did your parents manage though? Because here they have their 14-year-old baby boy. I mean, the baby, the family, they're, you know, the golden boy at this point in time, who's just come through a horrific medical experience, not just in the context of the heart attack, but now, you know, the ulcer and the bleeding and the whole visualization of that, because obviously you felt it, and it was clear how distressing that was for you as a 14-year-old. But they obviously felt it as well as parents. So on one hand, they have to deal with their youngest child, their baby son, and then they have to deal with the challenges of the business and that. How did they manage it at that point in time?
God, you know, just you know, sheer hard work and determination, and just, I think that you know, that was it. I mean, my father worked morning, noon, and night. He'd come home. he'd come home after being on the floor of the shop all day, and he'd have his dinner, and he'd get in his delivery van and go out and deliver the televisions that he had sold that day, or he'd go out and do service calls, or climb up on somebody's roof at dark in the middle of the night and fix their aerial for them, you know. And you know, my mother helped out, and we all helped out, you know, in terms of the different bits in the shop. But it was just, you know, sheer hard work, learning from the tough lessons, you know, of, you know, got to make sure that, you know, the cash is looked after, got to make sure that you've got all the necessary security from customers and staff, and all the different things that can go wrong in cash businesses and stuff. You know, so just, you know, learned those lessons and built, and you know, had to build his business back up again from effectively having to close it all down, and you know, go into kind of, you know, financial insolvency kind of situation, but built it back up, and you know, just kept going. And you know, by the time I was, you know, going into university, he had paid off every penny he owed everyone. He had got his business completely back up and running again, and back up to the kind of scale it had been before it crashed on him. And so yeah, just, you know, pick yourself up and go again, you know.
Isn't it a great sign of resilience in the face of enormous adversity? I mean, the adversity I have as younger son, and the medical challenge that you were faced with, you know, right throughout your life, but particularly, you know, around 14 onwards. His business, the challenges of that, as you say, and some people will listen to this and say, you know, what do you mean, like delivering TVs, or what do you mean aerials on the roof? But that's what the world was back in the 80s for people. But the resilience, you know, and that wouldn't mean a word I was talking about back then, Paul, in the 80s, resilience. So just the resilience against the adversity, and the courage you took to stay at it. That you must be very proud of your father for that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he was, you know, learned so much from him, and you know, just I mean, some of it, his passion for his customers was probably his most defining kind of trait. There's a couple of stories I remember. I remember one day I was standing on the shop floor, and a customer brought back a kettle. It was a Philips kettle, and we didn't sell Philips kettles. The competitor up the road, Joyce's, they sold Philips kettles, and we didn't sell Philips kettles. And he came back in, and the kettle was broken. And the customer, the customer came in and was giving out about his broken kettle that he had just brought, and Joyce's wouldn't take it back or replace it for him. And my father said, "Here, give me that kettle." And he took the Philips kettle from him, and he gave him a Krupp's kettle instead. Said, "There you go, there's your new kettle, off you go." And I was like, and the customer left the shop, and I said, "What are you doing? You know, he didn't buy that kettle from us." And my father said, "The same guy who supplies me with Krupp's kettles supplies Joyce's up the road with Philips kettles. I'll beat him up to get a Krupp's kettle swapped for that Philips kettle from the supplier." I said, "And that customer," he said, "that customer's never crossed the door of my shop before, but I know who they are, and I know that within a couple of years they're going to want a new television. They're probably going to want a new stereo system, and you know where they'll come next time." You know, so he had that mentality of look after the customer. The other great one was Christmas mornings. The last thing we would do, the one time my father wasn't great at customer service was 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Christmas in retail, crazy manic time. But 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve was the one time we said, "We're closing the shop at 6 o'clock on the dot, end of." And so he would run customers out of the shop at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. He would say, "Right, that's it, we're closed. Don't care if you haven't bought it, go. You're getting out." You know, he'd give them the warning and stuff. So, but he'd clear the shop at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and we'd be locking up. And the last thing he'd do would be he would take a big bag, and every battery we would have left in stock would go in the big bag. And with the big bag we'd bring home, and would be parked by the front door. And Christmas morning, 9:30, guaranteed, ding dong, the doorbell would go. Santa's forgot the batteries, and it would just be, there was never a penny taken. It was like, here you go, what do you need? And the doorbell, rural Ireland, the doorbell would go 5-10 times between 9 o'clock on Christmas morning and when we'd go out for mass at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, and it'd be people looking for batteries. So it'd be the last, it would be the last thing we'd always have, would be the bag of batteries at the door on Christmas morning.
Is that a brilliant reflection of great customer service? When you think about it, despite all the difficulties he faced, the fact that the business had its challenges and he had to bring it back from the ashes and rebuild it, the fact that at the center of his philosophy all the time was the customer. And to think about closing at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve makes sense, because you could be open at 7 or 8, it'd be the same issues you'd have at that point in time. But to bring a bag of batteries home, knowing that if customers were in trouble, they would come to me, and he had the foresight to be looking after them. And for me, Paul, that's one of the things that, like great companies have, whether it's as large, small, or medium, it doesn't make a difference. They really think about the customer. The customer is not necessarily always right now, by the way, because the customers must, in my experience, I would have always said to people in companies that I led, we must always deal with the customers. And your dad back in the 80s dealt with them in such a positive way. And as you said, it wasn't taking the money, because there was no money crossed hands on Christmas Day, but it was the affection for the customer, the sincerity of looking after the customer, and just the real care and attention, that knowing that if they needed it, I was there for them.
Yeah, that was exactly it, in terms of, so it was great, so it was, and once again, at the time, I didn't know what I was learning, but I would just grew up in that environment of, look after the customer, and in terms of, and he was world class at that.
Tell me about your mom, because obviously we can now visualize your dad, and we have a great impression of your dad. But you made a point earlier about your mom, that your mom was always there to help your dad in his good times and his difficult times in that sense. When you look back at your mom and the influences that she created on you throughout the early part of your life, what are the things that stand out for you?
Yeah, look, I'd say, in the main kind of our mom probably, in terms of she was the one that looked after us and raised us, in terms of, and she was a nurse by training, but she had left nursing, and she was working in the family business as well, and helping out in that, and as well as raising us 3 kids, she was rock solid, always there, always, once again, was someone who was kind of always attracted to, and still to this day, always attracted to the people who need care. She was fundamentally a carer. I would is the word I would use to describe her, and to her own detriment, is kind of, is drawn like a magnet to people who need that bit of extra care, or in terms of, she'll always find whoever needs the most care and give them that care, so as in her 70s, she obviously COVID has all interfered with it now, but in her 70s she's still going down to the local hall to help the old ones. I'm not sure when she'll become one of the old ones herself, but she's still helping the old ones.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating to hear about your mom and the caring aspect of it. Tell me about the challenges you had when you went to UCD, because obviously when you were in second level in St. Peter's College, you had your buddy who could help you out in primary school and second level, but now you're in UCD, which is, you have less people to help you out now in the context. How did you handle, first of all, the adjustment into college life, and then dealing with the challenges physically and with your short-sightedness, in the college?
Yeah, look, it was kind of, my life kind of changed after I came back from the heart operation in secondary school. My life kind of changed, because I don't know whether it was, this inner confidence that I had from, what I've been through and what I've come through, and that sense of, I've dealt with this now, so other stuff is pretty minor. I can deal with it, So a bit of that, probably a bit of sense of people were aware in school what I'd been through, were probably a bit nicer to me. I'd also grown quite a bit. When I was in hospital at 14 years of age, I broke 6 foot. I'm now 6'6". With the heart fixed, I wasn't quite as skinny as I was anymore. I kind of, so I got a little bit bigger and stuff. So, by the time I got to university, and then in my leaving cert, I did a lot better than I thought I was going to do. I probably thought I was going to get, maybe 1 or 2 A's and a hatful of B's, whereas I got 5 A's and 1 B. And once again, that listening and figuring out stuff really kind of came to the fore. So when I went to college, I was a far more confident person, in terms of, and I dealt with, in my later years in school as well, I got involved in debating and stuff, and that gave me a bit more confidence in public speaking and speaking up, standing up. So when I went to college, there was 300 people in a class in first year commerce. There was only one person from my school in that class. We didn't really know each other. We didn't know each other, we knew of each other and we knew each other, but we weren't friends or didn't hang around or anything. So we were quite different as people. So I didn't really know anybody. So I just decided, well, the best way to get to know people is to run for class rep. And so I ran for class rep and was lucky enough to get elected. And that kind of set me off on kind of in a student leadership position that, and I had fantastic fun in university, and I would say, I'd give out about not being able to see the board if I'd gone to very many lectures, but I was generally taking people's notes from the people who had been to lectures to survive my way through UCD. But look, it was a fantastic time, and in those days there wasn't much continuous assessment. It was mainly kind of year-end exams, so I could navigate that pretty well, and do loads of stuff in different clubs, societies, and things like that in college, and had a fantastic time there. Made loads of friends, and they were just great days.
You mentioned earlier that after college you went into Procter & Gamble in the UK. What role did you initially go in there, Paul?
Yeah, I went in as what was called a brand assistant, which was the entry level. And Procter & Gamble was a great first employer. And one of the reasons was, at the time, I'm not sure if they still do this, but at the time, they only hired at graduate entry level. They didn't hire any more senior than that. So the global chief executive of Procter & Gamble started in Procter & Gamble in the same job I had started in as a brand assistant, and had worked his way up through the management layers. So they were brilliant at investing and developing people, because this was their only source of their future management. So they invested hugely in training and development of their people right from the day you walk in the door. So, and I worked with fantastic people there, really, really fantastic people. So I started out working on the Ariel brand, the detergent. And then, the main business I worked on in Procter & Gamble was the Flash business. And that was a business that I took over when it was in all sorts of trouble and losing significant market share, and came up with a whole new strategy, product development strategy, marketing strategy, overall business management strategy, and we turned that business around and got it back into really healthy, significant growth. And that was a great learning experience, because it had everything in it. One day I was down with the advertising agency in London, and the next day I was crawling over pallets in the a manufacturing plant in Manchester, and the next day I'd be sitting in the labs with the scientists trying to figure out how to improve the formula. and spending loads of times in focus groups, listening to consumers and hearing them talk about how difficult it is to clean grout, bathroom tiling grout and stuff like that. So, fantastic breadth of experience, and the way Procter and Gamble run as a brand manager, you are the managing director of that brand, so you're responsible for the profit and everything about that brand. So technically, you're in the marketing department, but you are running the business, and you're charged with running the business, and you learn everything about business through that process. So it's really good.
And then you decided after Procter and Gamble to travel the world, you said.
Yeah, well, I kind of decided that I wanted to come back to Ireland. In terms of my dad had been sick, and it was kind of one of those situations where I hadn't appreciated how sick he'd been until after he kind of started to get better. And I said, oh look, I want to go home and try and build a life in Ireland and be closer to family and stuff like that. But I kind of said, well, if I do that, I'll probably, I probably won't travel again. So I'll take the opportunity. And living in the UK, so many of the people that I worked with at Procter and Gamble had done the gap year between college and starting their career. And I just loved the sound of that. So I said, right, I'm going to go back and live in Ireland. But before I go and live in Ireland, I'm going to take my gap year. And at that stage, I'd worked for 5 or 6 years. So I had saved a bit of money. I was a bit more mature, etc. So I was able to kind of enjoy it probably a little bit more for that. And so I spent a year traveling through Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, Nepal, and then back again to Ireland. So that was just a fantastic experience, obviously, to see all those places.
And when you look back at that year and traveling, as you say, the Southern Hemisphere and Southeast Asia, what stands out for you? Because you're more mature now, as you say, than the people who went, in the early part before they joined Procter and Gamble. What stood out for you in that journey?
Wow. Well, so many things. I tried my hand at so many things, in terms of I almost got to the top of Kilimanjaro, but had to turn around because of altitude sickness. And that was another one of those scary moments where, in terms of you realize you have to get down off that mountain pretty quickly, or you might not make it, kind of thing, because we just climbed too quickly. And so just the only solution for altitude sickness is descent. So I remember that night effectively running in the dark from 6 o'clock. With the night we were supposed to summit, everyone was resting up, getting ready to summit. I got a really bad bit of altitude sickness and had to grab a porter, and the two of us ran down that night what we had climbed in the previous 2.5 days, and we ran till about midnight, and then I was feeling better again. But that was that stands out as a moment. I then, of course, not wanting to stop, I went on, climbed to Everest Base Camp when we got to Nepal and the Annapurna Sanctuary, and went slower and learned my lesson and didn't suffer from altitude sickness that time. But just seeing fantastic parts of the world like that, and getting the opportunity. I suppose that was one of the things that made me as passionate about doing the job that I'm doing now, in terms of seeing. And I remember particularly New Zealand they were so good at turning anything into a tourism opportunity, in terms of there was guys with holes in the ground in their fields that they turned into pothole and caving experiences, where you're putting on wetsuits and helmets and getting down into the caves and going through narrow gaps and stuff. But they were making a great living out of doing that. And remember, it was a garage, like literally a bus stop that we had to stop to get petrol in the middle of nowhere. But they had built a maze out of hedgerows at the back of their garage. And we all gladly, everyone who got off that bus gladly gave them 10 New Zealand dollars to run around that maze for half an hour, while the bus driver was taking a rest and stuff. So I just thought, learned, that sense of the ability to, they had a great ability to turn anything into a tourist attraction, and they had the beautiful landscape to do it. And I suppose that was one of the things that when I came back to Ireland, I was kind of, ever since then, since that day, I wanted the job I have now, which was how do we do in Ireland, make Ireland exploit all those unexploited opportunities that are still there for tourism growth. So they're just some of the memories from then.
Everest Base Camp must be an amazing experience, because I was watching a film recently about the time that there was an avalanche and that a lot of the locals were killed in that tragically. But it's hard for people who haven't been there to visualize it. So how could you describe it, this base camp in Everest?
Yeah, it's I mean, in terms of, it's not at all dangerous to go there. In terms of, provided you go slowly and manage the altitude sickness, there's no technical climbing. It's hiking. It's basically, in terms of long, relatively high altitude, 5,500 meters kind of hiking in altitude. So it's when you go above base camp is when you've got crampons and ladders and all that dangerous stuff that you watch in those, into thin airs and Everest movies and stuff like that. But in terms of, so it's really, there's just the way we did it was there's kind of a large area where people set up base camp and stuff, and then there's when I say a small summit, it's still about, I think, 300 or 400 meters above base camp, called Kalapatar, and you trek to there, and that's where you kind of get the view, and then you go back down below. So on one day you get to base camp, you get to the area where base camp is at about lunchtime on the day, and then you turn around and you come back down to where you spent the previous night. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the big thing there is the Nepalese people. The Nepalese people are just, the most amazing, nicest people in the world that you could ever really meet. I mean, they are just a phenomenal race of people in terms of their, their friendliness, their generosity, their welcomingness. I mean, their resilience and their strength to do what they do at the altitude they do it is just phenomenal,
Because when I was watching this film Sherpa, what I found, Paul, was that their ability to operate at altitude is what really separates them in so many ways, we said, from Westerners. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, you literally, I mean, we were trekking along on, and we were fairly fit at this stage, but we were still trekking along, at 4,500, 5,000 meters altitude, which is what, 3 times the height of Carntúil, or if not more than that actually, but with just relatively light backpacks on and all the hiking gears and our proper boots and socks and everything. And then these, the Nepalese guys would be going by you in their flip-flops with, wooden planks almost the size of telegraph poles balanced on their head, because they'd be carrying them up to build a new hut or something like that. And they would be literally carrying these huge 8-inch or 8 or 10 inch by 8 or 10 inch, 8 foot long blocks of wood on their head, with kind of t-shirts and towels wrapped around it to balance on their head, kind of thing, in their flip-flops. Just phenomenal.
It's great admiration, isn't it, for for what people can do in the most difficult of circumstances. And I think sometimes we in the Western world are spoiled in what we are expected to do. Tell me, you came back to Ireland then, and you went into Diageo, and you spent time there, and then you spent time in Aviva in senior marketing roles. 2 very different industries.
Yeah, in terms of when I went in, when I went into Diageo, it was Guinness Ireland Group at the time, and I'll be honest, from having worked in Procter and Gamble in the UK, it felt like I'd gone back 100 years in terms of to a very old-fashioned, fairly dysfunctional, highly, in not in a good way, a highly unionized type environment. So that was very strange. But I was part of the beginning, and it wasn't driven by me because I was relatively junior, but I came in at the same time as a new managing director, and Diageo was just kind of being formed. And I was lucky enough to be part of the group of managers that were kind of leading the culture change in that business and turning it into, what is the modern day Diageo, which is a lot more like the Procters and Gambles and Unilevers and Mars and stuff, in terms of, high functioning, high performance, investing in management capability, high integrity, relatively low level of kind of internal politics and stuff. So it was and then as a marketeer working in that, it was a pretty unique set of circumstances, because the per unit profitability at the time of alcohol sales in Ireland was really high, and fundamentally because it was mainly a draft beer market, and you can't really, it's economically, it doesn't make sense to be shipping kegs across the sea. So it was a domestic production. The models favored domestic production, so it was a battle between the domestic producers. The pricing was relatively high. There was everyone in the chain was making good money, including the tax man, who was making the best money of everyone. But everyone was making good money. But the difference it meant as a marketeer, that an extra 0.5% of growth on your business really fed through to the bottom line. So therefore, it was worth spending the marketing money to get that 0.5% growth, but it was worth spending the marketing money to understand how to make that TV ad work 0.5% better or work 1% better. So you really fine-tuned that set of economics really enabled you to fine-tune your ability to be a really good marketeer, and to do the research and to do all of the due diligence to make sure that, right, have I got that label perfect? Have I got that TV ad perfect? Because that extra little bit of a percent was worth it, and it was worth investing the money. So we learned really how to fine tune our marketing skills in that kind of environment. And in terms of, at the time in Diageo, we were investing about 100 million euros a year in marketing. And that's a huge amount in the Irish market context. And so, we became really, really good marketeers. And once again, I was lucky enough to work with a great team, and we had a super team, and so many of the people that worked with me in the marketing department then have now gone on to be marketing directors of banks and telecommunication companies and various other things, in terms of, so it was a great team, and we worked really well together, and really kind of, as well as the cultural change and Diageo investing in us as people and us as leaders, and that was where I came across as well, actually, great places to work. We've worked with them now in Fáilte Ireland and become one of the best workplaces in Ireland, but understanding that the ability to be a high performance organization, and the importance of having super engaged employees to deliver that high performance, we learned all of that in Diageo. So that was great. Moving to Aviva then, well, that was a different kettle of fish.
Paul, just before we go to Aviva, you mentioned that when you went into Diageo, you were junior, and then at the time a new MD came in, and him, I assume, was it him or her?
Him, yeah.
Yeah, so he then, along with you and others, grew as a management team, and you said that you created this really high performance culture. you talked about great places to work. What was what were the things that created that culture? What were the things that you look back down your time there, as you say, in addition to the great places to work who gave you a great understanding, but what were the things that made the switch, the pivot into this high performance culture that obviously became very successful in Diageo?
It was interesting because I worked under 3 different managing directors of the Irish business, and they all brought different things. The first one was the revolutionary who had kind of come in from PepsiCo, and a guy called Sean Holliday. And Sean left after, I think, a year and a half or so that I was there. He went off and then joined kind of an internet startup business. But what Sean did was Sean started the process of breaking the concrete of the existing culture. And he brought in, he brought in some really good management psychologists and high-level tools from companies like YSC and stuff like that. And for the first time, senior managers were getting 360-degree feedback. People were having honest conversations. There was the sense of, no, it's not good enough. If something is annoying you, it's not good enough to let it annoy you. You need to say it. If somebody, you don't walk out of here with a stone in your shoe, put it on the table. And that was a whole new concept. And that was, encouraging people to have those really honest conversations. And, that didn't come with initial business success, because we had to go through, the business disruption of the psychological disruption, but that concrete needed to be broken. It was interesting. I chatted to Sean because we both joined the Irish business on the same day, and we both come from the same kind of backgrounds. And I remember chatting to him at the time, and I said, "Look, God, you're investing so much money in this." In this management, we these consultants walking the corridors morning, noon, and night with us, and he said, "Look, well," he said, "Paul, between you and me," he said, "I can't fire everyone, so we have to change the culture, it's so ingrained that that the only way to change the culture is either change how everyone thinks." Or change all of the people. And we can't change all of the people. It'd be the wrong thing to do. And there's great people here. They just learn to think and act a different way. And that's been rewarded in the past. So we went through that breaking the culture, and Sean brought that to it. Then a guy called Brian Duffy brought a steady hand again, and kind of, because there was kind of a huge amount of disruption, and Brian was a bit more, guys, we got to get back to doing the business, but was able to do that more successfully because of what Sean had done previously. And then I suppose it all came together in my mind when the next managing director came in, a guy called Michael Iachimides, and Michael kind of brought the best of it all together in terms of, really did a super job at making sure everybody understood what their job was, making sure that all of those connections worked really well, and really brought the whole process excellence and high performance mindset into and real focus into everything. And so the three brought three different things, and by the end of it, we were, we had turned around and we're growing profit, growing share, employee engagement scores up in the high 80s. Really, it was holistically, it was a super place to work. So it was great but you had to go through that journey of kind of smashing the existing culture and then kind of painstakingly building a new one.
What I love is the line breaking the concrete, and then the analogy of the pebble in the shoe, because obviously it fits with the concrete. And that, because I've always said to clients, Sean, that I work with organizations and individuals, you've got to get it on the table. You've got it, because if you don't get it on the table, you're doing yourself a disservice, you're doing the organization a disservice, and ultimately it's still in your pocket or in your shoe or in your mind or wherever you have it. So, Michael obviously evolved what, Sean and Brian had done in their own different ways to bring it all together. Tell me about then Aviva, which is a complete transition into the financial services world.
Yeah, so I was I was happily going along in Diageo. I was at the time I had done about 3.5, coming up on 4 years as marketing director for Diageo Ireland. I was looking for my next move, and I had 2 young kids and 2 more on the way, and, with twins, and the next move for me in Diageo was going to be into a global brand role where there would be a lot of travel, so I wasn't, I was okay with that, but not particularly enamored. But I didn't want to stay in the job I was in, kind of thing, because I felt I'd outgrown that now. And then got a call from a headhunter saying, at the time it was Hibernian Insurance, saying, would you come and work for Hibernian Insurance? To which my response was, well, it'd take an awful lot of money to make me want to do that. To which his response was, how much? I named a figure that I thought was stupid. And the response was, yeah, I think we might be able to manage that. So, and I suppose that probably says something about where financial services were pre the crash. But so it was I made the move. It was predominantly, and I probably learned from that, don't move for money. It was a really interesting time in Aviva. It was a really roller coaster. We did, what they knew, but no one knew at the time, was they were doing the brand transition. Hibernian at the time was the best known, biggest, most loved Irish insurance brand. And obviously with a name like Hibernian, it's a very Irish brand. They were doing the name change to Aviva because it was a relatively new company formed globally, and they wanted everywhere to become Aviva. As much for internal reasons as external reasons, to try and drive a one team kind of approach. And they needed someone to help them to do that name change, and they needed, in terms of, they wanted to bring in, as good skill as they could get in terms of marketing in Ireland to do that. So it was a really interesting marketing challenge to go from a brilliantly well-loved name to a complete unknown name, and to try and do it. We, at the same time, it was my second day in the business when the then managing director said to me, look, we're looking at buying this health insurance business. We know nothing about health insurance. I said, well, neither do I. He said, well, you're as good as the rest of us then. So can you go to the meeting and get involved in that? It then became my job to build the revenue and profit projection model for the health insurance business to work out how much it'd be worth us paying for it. And that was be involved in an acquisition and be involved in something I'd never been involved in before. So that was really interesting. And we ended up buying it. It was Aviva's Health at the time. It became Hibernian Health. We then switched it to Aviva Health, and it's now, I think it's now the Irish Life Health business, as that business has been sold on. So it was really interesting to be involved in that, as well as the name change. Probably one of the most exciting things in Aviva was the stadium sponsorship. So the stadium company, which was a joint venture between the IRFU and the FAI, were looking for a title sponsor for the stadium. They needed the money from a title sponsor to finish the stadium build, they thought it'd be great if it could be called Hibernia Stadium. They didn't know we were doing the name change. We obviously did at that time, and from my point of view, we had identified that as part of the name change, we need something that says we're Irish, but we're international, because Aviva is clearly an international name. We're Irish, but on an international stage. We're long-term committed to Ireland, and it's really going to drive brand awareness because no one's heard of our brand. And from a sponsorship point of view, the fit didn't get any better than what the Aviva Stadium bought. brought to us. So that was a great deal to do, but it was a really difficult deal. Aviva had never done anything that big anywhere in the world in marketing. In the home market of the UK, they'd never done anything like that. So that was politically quite difficult, because here they were, an English company, putting their biggest investment in marketing ever into Ireland, not into England, and a few noses out of joint in the English marketing department over that. So a lot of politics, internal politics to manage there. There was also loads of risks, because there was loads of debates of, oh, will the matches stay in the Aviva Stadium? Will they go to Croke Park for the big matches? Will people call it Aviva Stadium, or will they still call it Lansdowne Road? At this stage, it was just a hole in the ground. The old stadium had not been. Will they run out of money before they build it? And will we be tied into this sponsorship deal? And really importantly, the deal they needed to do was a bulletproof deal, because they needed to take our sponsorship money, which we pay roughly 4 million a year for the next 10 years, and bring it to a securitization company, because they needed all the cash now. So they were turning that into about 30 million in cash now to finish the stadium. But it basically meant we had to sign a deal that said, come hell or high water, we'll pay the 4 million euros a year. And which you never do as a sponsor, because your ultimate thing is that if they don't deliver what they said they're going to deliver, you don't pay them the money. We were taking away that. So I had to come up with a mechanism that would mean that was safe. So we had this really complicated deal where we pay the stadium company that money come hell or high water, but we had these side letters with the FAI and the IRFU that if they didn't deliver the rights, and they were different legal entities, if they didn't deliver the rights, we could then sue the IRFU and the FAI for, we'd have a contract with them that if they didn't meet, we could then sue them based on that contract. So it was a really complicated deal, and we had to think about everything that could possibly happen and possibly go wrong. Which interestingly, in the context of the pandemic, means that the Aviva Stadium contract deal is probably one of the few contract deals that has got a pre-written into it of what happens if matches can't happen for public health reasons in the Aviva Stadium. So Aviva are protected now, 12 years later, from the likes of a pandemic, because there's a clause in the contract about sponsorship extension to make up for the fact that there haven't been matches there over the course of COVID. But it was a really interesting deal.
Yeah, fascinating to get the background to what's really a phenomenally successful sponsorship for Aviva. There's no doubts in that, and people now call it the Aviva Stadium. That brand recognition is instant at this point in time. Maybe some people of an older generation might still have affection for Lansdowne Road, but if you take it, I would say the significantly vast majority of the population call it the Aviva Stadium.
I remember we had about 2 weeks after we had signed the deal, I was on the Dart one day going by the building site, which was then the hole in the ground in Lansdowne Road, or now at this stage there was stadiums beginning to appear out of it. And as we went by the site, the building site, there was a bunch of teenagers on the Dart that, just as we went by the site, started chanting "Aviva, Aviva, Aviva." And I said at that moment, we got this. He said, I'm not worried about Lansdowne Road anymore. We got this. These guys will be the guys, they'll need car insurance in 3 years' time. And they're chanting Aviva. But look, we learned a lot. We learned about, how the O2 did the naming of the O2 arena and stuff like that. So we learned that the day we announced the sponsorship, we were wall to wall with, and it was really interesting because all this has been kept confidential. We had wall to wall bookings with practically every radio station, every national radio station, and all of the Dublin local ones, of competitions to win tickets for the first matches. And the marketing thinking behind that was, if people hear someone calling it the Aviva Stadium, that's going to make them call it the Aviva Stadium. So our role was a huge part of it. So we had all these DJs lined up to give away these tickets. They got them we signed the deal at 10 o'clock in the morning, did the press release. The DJs by 11 o'clock had the briefing of saying, it's the Aviva Stadium, that's what you have to call it, that's what the competition is for. They didn't know before that, but for a week after that day, from an hour after the deal was signed, there was radio competitions and DJs talking about winning tickets to the Aviva Stadium for a week after, which gave us a really good head start on getting that phrase into people's heads.
It's a great lesson in branding and marketing, in that, you know, the foundation is critical. And what you did an hour after signing the deal, he made a foundation so secure by having, as you say, you know, all the media outlets, you know, repeat the name of Aviva Stadium, giving some prizes out for tickets. But it really set the bedrock in. And as I said earlier, Paul, there's no doubt that it's the Aviva Stadium now. There's, you know, it's unquestioned success of that marketing initiative. I want to bring you forward, Paul, to Fáilte Ireland, because obviously you went into consultancy for a while, but you said on your world travel experience after Procter & Gamble that you saw things in New Zealand, as you say, potholes and gardens and people putting on helmets and diving down in that sense, you know, a bus stopping it behind a shop or a rest stop for the bus driver, and a maze out the back, and you paying 10 New Zealand dollars and, you know, spending a half an hour running around this maze and hoping to get back out before whoever else was on the bus. And you wanted at that point in time the job that you now have. When you got the job, you know, what was your ambition for it? You know, it's 3 or 4 years ago. What was your ambition for it when you took on the job?
It was, I suppose, you know, it was to, you know, to maximize the potential that and the benefit that Ireland could get from tourism. So, you know, we're not, as I say, kind of, and you know, in terms of, you know, we're not here to serve the tourist industry. We're not here to serve visitors. We're here for the people of Ireland. Our shareholders are the people of Ireland, and our job is to deliver, you know, economic, social, environmental, community benefits to the people in Ireland, and cultural benefits to the people in Ireland. And tourism is the tool we have to do that with. And the only way we can do that is if we have a world-class industry and we provide brilliant visitor experiences. But they're a means to an end. And you know, in terms of, so we want to provide brilliant visitor experience, but the reason we want to provide brilliant visitor experience is because it leads to jobs in communities all around the country, that makes rural communities sustainable and stuff like that. So it was just, I've always been motivated by the couple of things. I've been motivated by the empty part of the glass, you know. So if the glass is you know, if the glass is half full, it's the half that isn't full that motivates me. So that sense of unexploited opportunity, I remember, and I think, you know, I remember at the time saying to the chairman, Michael Cawley, on the interview panel, I said to him, I said, Michael, if you want someone to come here and tell you you're doing a great job and everything is wonderful, don't hire me, because we'll fight all the time. I said, I am, you know, there's lots of great things that Fáilte Ireland are doing, but I'm frustrated by the stuff that's not being done yet. And I said, that's what motivates me, that's what drives me. And you know, not to diminish any of the great work that's been done, but I think there's so much more that can be done. You know, luckily it was a high risk strategy.
Yeah.
But it was honesty, and you know, so and that's, I suppose, look, that's what, you know, in terms of that passionate belief that we have such a wonderful country and we have such a welcoming and wonderful population, that we can do so much more with the right type of investment and the right type of support, and deliver so much more in terms of you know, jobs and revenue and economic contribution from tourism.
And obviously, it's been a successful journey, you know, from the inception, particularly because Michael Cawley, you know, supported you. And he would, you know, I know Michael, he would like that type of leadership, that people, you know, don't want to be yes people. He wants people who create innovation and drive a business. But then the pandemic hit, and of all the sectors of industry, the hospitality and tourism sector has really suffered the most, Paul. There's no questions, than any other. I mean, retail has had very difficult times in many aspects of retail, but it has had open periods as well. But the hospitality and tourism has really been struck down for practically all of this pandemic. How have you dealt from the point of view of Fáilte Ireland with that, and how have you supported, Ireland Link as you described earlier?
Yeah, I think, and look, yeah, hospitality has been impacted. There's probably, in fairness, the arts, culture, entertainment, and sports sector have probably also suffered the same sort of, complete closure almost that hospitality has. So they and they haven't been, you can't, in terms of, you can't sell a night in a hotel online. You can't deliver it to somebody's door. So so they haven't been able to kind of pivot that in the same way as some retail, have been able to do click and collect and stuff like that. So and look, I mean, it has been massively devastating on the tourism and hospitality sector. How we've tried to do with that, I suppose, is, in terms of from the outset, we made a couple of decisions. First of all, we said, right, we're going to get, and then, in terms of, I've got a great team of directors, and some of them were there through the last crash, etc. And I said to them, I said, look, you guys have been here before. You've been through the last crisis. I said, I haven't led an organization through crisis. What do you do? And in terms of Paul Keeley, one of our director of regional developments, said to me, he said, Paul, first thing we do is we get really close to industry. He said, we are close. We've got to get closer. You just get really close to industry. We set up. It was before the end of last February, before people even realized how bad the crisis was going to be. We set up our COVID advisory group. We had weekly calls with all of the sector leaders and a representative of, different operators within there. We got a great group of people, and, in terms of, we listened to what they were saying every week. We adjusted our plans based on that, adjusted what we were doing. We were constantly changing and doing different things. We were, and that was one of the things. We also, we called all staff together, and I was actually on my feet at a socially distanced. We ran I think it was 3 or 4 different staff briefings because we couldn't get all the staff in the same room, socially distanced at the time. But I was on my feet, socially distanced, doing 4 repeating all staff conferences. The day that Leo stood up on the in Washington or New York, Cambridge, and basically said, everyone go home. It was the 12th of March last year. And at that time, we were talking to the staff and we're saying, look, as we go through this crisis, I said, we're citizens of Ireland first, we're public servants second, and we're Fáilte Ireland employees third. I said, and that's how we're going to navigate and think about this crisis. So we're going to act whatever's best interest as good citizens. We're going to be good citizens. We're going to be good public servants, and then we're going to be as good as we can possibly be as Fáilte Ireland employees for the tourism industry. And that's been kind of the compass that we've navigated it by. We've had some of our staff went off to help the Department of Social Welfare process the original wave of pandemic unemployment payments. Our marketing guys have helped the HSE on several of their highest profile campaigns. We have, I believe, the best marketing talent in the government system working for us. So we put that at the disposal of the HSE to help them with their critical public health campaigns. But, not in any way to distract from the support for the tourism industry in terms of we've put in place, a COVID supports hub. We were constantly putting up new programs in terms of how to deal with the HR issues around kind of closing down, how to deal with the financial issues, how to manage your premises through it. So all things people hadn't dealt before, we were quickly getting best practice and sharing it with industry. Then we did all the reopening guidelines when it was time to reopen. And once again, we didn't take a view of, well, we're only tourism and stuff. We said, look, we'll do the reopening guidelines for restaurants, for food serving pubs, for anyone that came anywhere within our kind of anywhere near our sphere. We said, look, we'll do everything we can to help here. So yeah, I mean, the response I've never seen an organization pivot and respond the way people respond. It was incredibly from my big concern now as a leader of the organization is to get people to slow down a little bit, because I'm worried about the sustainability, in terms of, trying to tell people, take some days off, take some annual leave, it'll be here when you get back, because the rate people have been working morning, noon and night, weekends, constantly, turning stuff around really quickly, getting it out, the nature of stuff and the speed at which it's been changed, stuff that would have taken us months to do under normal circumstances, we were turning around in days, and it was just all shoulders to the wheel and trying to get everything up and running, all while we had moved to a remote working environment. One of the big things, I suppose, there was communication, really important, in terms of, we put in place, we were speaking to the industry weekly. We had, when we went to remote working, the day we went home, we ended up having an executive team meeting that we would have had probably once every 2 weeks. They moved to daily, 8:30 every morning. The directors and myself got together. We had authority meetings every week, which we normally would have had once a quarter. We normally would have spoke to all staff twice a year. We set up all staff communications weekly. So we just massively ramped up the frequency of communication so that we could keep everyone up to speed with what it was they needed to do. And I remember early on in the crisis, I saw something. It was an interview with, I can't remember the general's name now, but he was the general who was the most successful in leading the fight against Al-Qaeda in the US military. And he had talked about how in the crisis, you give the individual units the power to make the decisions, but you make sure they have the information. And it's all about getting the information to the unit division commanders and then letting them have the freedom to get on and make the decision. So you don't try and run it in command and control where everything has to come back to the top. You get the information as close to the people on the ground as possible. And that was very helpful for me, because that was the approach we took in terms of trying to give people as much freedom to make the decisions they needed to make, but keep the information flowing to them so they had the most up-to-date information to make those decisions.
It's a fascinating insight, Paul, into how Fáilte Ireland have navigated, the challenges internally and obviously externally through the pandemic. I really love the clarity about that we're citizens, public servants, and Fáilte Ireland in that order, because that actually releases the individuals to also think about it from that perspective, from that lens. From somebody who started life in Wexford with many challenges, you had blood challenges, you had skin challenges, you had sight challenges, and you had a heart challenge. To me, the heart surgery at 14 years of age and the blood transfusion, that was a real pivot in your life, because you came out of that, you made a point earlier, you grew 6 inches, you got stronger, you got more confident, and that with the resilience that you learned from your father, the care aspect of life that you learned from your mother, has definitely set you out on the journey to becoming the exceptional leader that you have. And I want to thank you so much for joining me here today and sharing what has been a fascinating story and look back at the journey to date of Paul Kelly, CEO of Fáilte Ireland. Thank you very much for spending time with me on the Mindset Shift.
You're very welcome, Tim. Thanks. I enjoyed the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching The Mindset Shift. For more episodes, check out www.talenthub.ie/The Mindset Shift.